All right, let's continue then with reaction to the midterm budget policy statement as delivered by the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana earlier on today. Busisiwe Mavuso, Business Leadership South Africa CEO, joins us live now. Good evening to you and thank you so much for your time. The Finance Minister saying that this policy statement is to outline the strategy towards the economy and, of course, growing it there and retaining the health of the public finances. Did he succeed in painting this picture?
He definitely succeeded. I really think that he did a decent job of presenting a solid budget, delivered with strained resources, but he still managed to strike a good balance between fiscal discipline and directing revenue to areas that will boost economic growth over the long term. It's important that he managed to stick and to adhere to fiscal discipline, which is important because that has been recognized internationally and it actually remains a very important tick on the pros list when investors assess the country's investment potential. So it's been a very difficult budget, especially because the tax revenue has actually gone down. It's lower by 22.3 billion rands, than what was projected in February. And those lower tax revenues means that we cannot accommodate all of the demands that have actually been placed on the fiscus. The lower revenues means that there's going to have to be difficult trade-offs, in all spheres of government that need to be made. So I think with the hand that he has been dealt and the difficulty of the situation, he has definitely done a brilliant job.
And looking at these trade-offs as well, you then add the issue of the debt, which he says that it's quite unsustainable. And if things continue this way, it can really just make things difficult going forward. But saying that if the discipline continues, then maybe things may start to look better as the decade goes by.
Absolutely. So I think he speaks about the fact that the debt service costs, are the largest component of spending, which means that our debt continues to grow faster than our economic growth. Now, that is a very dangerous space to be in. South Africa needs to find itself in a situation and in a position where we have the opposite. The economy is growing faster and the debt is actually growing less. Because remember, there is the cost of capital that is actually attached to the debt. And South Africa, being a sub-investment grade country, means that our cost of capital is high. So it cannot be right, when you look at South Africa's income statement and you look at our expenses, that we are spending more on debt than we are on education. We are spending more on debt than we are on health. We are spending more on debt than we are on policing. So we therefore have to try and reverse that. I know a lot of people are actually criticizing the minister. They are saying that he has actually delivered an austerity budget. I say it was not an austerity budget. It was actually a realistic budget, a budget that ensures that South Africa lives within its means, because we really cannot continue to borrow ourselves out of this mess. What we need to focus on is to put interventions and measures in place which will ensure that the economy grows at the right level, because when the economy is growing at the right level, then we can then start to reduce the debt and repay the debt. At the moment, there is no room whatsoever in our fiscus to can actually start paying back the debt. So therefore, the structural reform agenda that we're focusing on and the 4 pillars that the minister actually spoke about, of national treasury that are meant to lift the economy to a higher and more inclusive growth path is precisely what we should be focusing on. So very well, a good job done by the minister.
And when it comes to, these 4 pillars, one of them, of course, the infrastructure, as he mentions, and he talks about the reforms that he says that investments, of course, are being touted to ensure that there's greater private sector participation, for example, through the financing and technical expertise, in order to make up for some of the incapabilities when it comes to the capacity of the state. How key is this for the business sector?
It's absolutely important. It's important because remember the mess that we find ourselves in, the high levels of unemployment that we have as a country, the low levels of economic growth that we have as a country is precisely because we have been failing at the fundamentals as a country. It's because our trading environment is actually not conducive. It's because that we have not been getting the right levels of investment, precisely because, it has been difficult to do business in South Africa. It has been difficult to do business in South Africa because the network industries have been dysfunctional. You've got 4 network industries in this country. You've got energy, you've got transport and logistics, you've got water, you've got telecoms. Out of the 4, only telecoms has been functioning as it should. The other 3 have been dysfunctional. It's only now that we have actually managed to get the energy issue right with 220 20 days, if I'm not mistaken, today without load shedding. Transport, logistics and water still continue to be a problem. If you remember at the beginning of the year, I think it was the IMF which actually said to South Africa, the growth that you think you are going to get this year, you won't be able to get it because of Transnet. So the structural reform agenda therefore becomes important because it seeks to therefore, fix these problems. We have seen the reform agenda that has actually been implemented on energy. We now have an ERA bill that has been signed. We now have private sector participation, which means that even if Eskom were to go bust tomorrow, even if Eskom were to go dysfunctional, the economy is not going to be choked because Eskom is dysfunctional, because now you have actually introduced other players which can provide electricity, and that is important. You have actually introduced competition into the sector, and that is what we're doing with transport and logistics as well. So we have actually been choked and hamstrung by these monopolies. So when you have one company that is supplying a service, if that company can't perform, the entire economy is decimated. And that is what has happened in South Africa over the past 15 years. So the structural reforms therefore seek to reverse that. And I think that's why, it was important that the minister actually outlined, that as part of the core focus areas and 4 pillars of national treasury, reforms are one of the things that we're going to be accelerating and we're going to be focusing on.
Busi, then in light of that, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on him reflecting on Operation Vulindlela and what it has done so far, citing a 50% reduction in the cost of data, for example, reduction in the waiting period for obtaining water use licenses from almost a year to 90 days, the e-visa system to travelers from around 34 countries. Your take?
So that when you talk about our environment not being conducive, trading environment not being conducive, you're talking about precisely all those things. And Operation Vulindlela was actually brought in to address those challenges. And they've done a phenomenal job of actually addressing them. One of the other ones that you haven't mentioned is the work visas. The fact that you are saying as a country, I'm trying to get foreign direct investment into the country, and you are saying to the world, I'm open for business. And when the world comes to you and say, we want to invest, it takes you a year to process a work visa. Now, do you really think that investors are going to wait for us, for a year, while we're processing our work visa, or will they actually go somewhere else? Because remember, in this middle economies and emerging economies, developing economies strata, there's about 40 countries that investors can actually choose from. So if South Africa doesn't have its house in order, if it keeps me waiting for a year while processing a simple work visa, I take my money somewhere else. And that is why there's been the minimal foreign direct investment that has been coming into the country. There's been investment that has been redirected from South Africa to East Africa. So though that work that has been done by Operation Vulindlela has been important to address this issue that we've been complaining about as business, that our environment has not been conducive. So they've done a phenomenal job. And the minister is saying that is precisely what government is going to continue to focus on, because that is how you lift ourselves out of poverty. That is how you deal with unemployment. You fix the reforms and implement the reforms, you have a conducive environment. You get a conducive environment, investment comes in. Investment comes in, the economy grows at the right level. The economy grows at the right levels, you can then employ more people. That is the only way in which we actually get this right. So we are focusing precisely where we should be focusing on to actually ensure that we unlock, the entire supply chain of growing our economy.
So what I'm hearing you say then in closing is that continue doing what you're doing, build on what you're doing. Let us not simply relax, because this economy does need a major boost to grow.
We cannot relax when you have 65%, youth unemployment, and you have no plan of how you're going to absorb them. Instead, we are shedding jobs, on a day-to-day basis. I think it was 4 weeks ago when our unemployment stats were actually shown, we actually saw an uptick of about 0.3%. So when you are sitting in that situation as a country, absolutely continue to do what you've been doing, because those who are saying, why can't we borrow more money? borrow more money and repay it how? Because as I said earlier on, you can't borrow ourselves out of this mess. You need to find sustainable ways and interventions of how you actually become profitable and sustainable as a country. And the structural reform agenda is the only way in which you do that. So the structural reform agenda and the commitment to that by the minister, by this government of national unity, is precisely the right thing to do.
All right, interesting insights this evening. Thank you so much for your time. That was Busisiwe Mavuso, Business Leadership South Africa CEO. Let's take a short break. We're back straight after with more.